The grip was tight, bunching the fabric of a charcoal suit jacket that had cost more than Officer Willie Hernandez's monthly take-home pay. To the management of the Grand Marble Hotel, the man standing in their lobby was a problem to be removed. A face that didn't match the marble floors, the crystal chandelier, the five-star silence of a place that had decided, long before he walked through the door, that he did not belong. Hernandez screamed as he shoved the man toward the exit, his voice bouncing off the gold-veined columns, loud and ugly in a room built for quiet wealth. He thought he was doing the hotel a favor. He thought he was keeping the peace. He had no idea that the man whose jacket he was crushing in his fist wasn't a trespasser. He wasn't a vagrant. He wasn't a mistake. He was Commander Robert Watts, 25 years of naval service, 2 commendations, a veteran's pin on his lapel, and the active chief investigator of a Congressional Oversight Committee on Law Enforcement. Hernandez didn't just throw a man out of a hotel. He threw a grenade into the rest of his career. 4 hours later, the Grand Marble's management would be signing a check for $8.9 million, and Willie Hernandez would be handing in his badge. The Charleston air in late October carried the smell of salt water and old money. It was a Thursday evening. It was the kind that settled over the city like a pressed linen jacket, cool, composed, expensive. The Grand Marble Hotel rose above the cobblestone street like a monument to itself. Its facade all white stone and brass fittings, its entrance flanked by topiary and a doorman in a coat that cost more than most people's rent. Robert Watts stepped out of the Blacktown car that had collected him from the airport and stood for a moment on the sidewalk. And he was a tall man, broad across the shoulders in the way that only decades of physical discipline produces, his silver hair cropped close, his face carrying the particular stillness of someone who had stood watch on the deck of a warship at 3 a.m. and learned that panic was a luxury the ocean didn't allow. He was wearing the charcoal suit. The American flag pin was on the left lapel, the same pin he had worn the day he retired. His reservation had been confirmed 3 weeks ago. The gala honoring distinguished military service was being held in the Grand Marble's ballroom. He was one of 4 honorees. He adjusted his cuffs, picked up his garment bag, and walked through the front doors. He knew exactly what he looked like to the wrong kind of room. He had known it for 55 years. He had walked into rooms like this his entire career. The Navy's war rooms, the Pentagon's briefing suites, the marble corridors of Capitol Hill, and there was always a moment. A flicker behind someone's eyes. A half-second of recalibration. He had learned to read it the way a navigator reads weather. He saw it in the desk clerk's face the moment she looked up. The smile that appeared was the right shape, but it didn't reach her eyes. She picked up the phone before he reached the counter. Robert noted it. He said nothing. He set his bag down gently and placed his confirmation printout on the marble surface between them. Behind the desk, and in an office with a view of the lobby, General Manager Craig Ashford watched through the interior window. He reached for his own phone. He dialed a number he had used before for situations like this, situations that, in his mind, required a certain kind of management. The call connected on the second ring. Officer Willie Hernandez, a thick-shouldered man with a red face and the particular confidence of someone who had never once been told he was wrong. Hernandez was 4 years on the beat. He arrived in 6 minutes. He didn't ask for a name. He didn't ask to see a reservation. He looked at Robert Watts, and he made a decision. And the decision cost everyone in that building everything. Hernandez crossed the lobby in 8 steps. He grabbed the jacket. He started screaming. Robert Watts did not move. He stood beneath the chandelier, the crystal throwing light in every direction, at 100 small suns. And he absorbed the grip and the noise with the absolute stillness of a man who had survived things that would have broken Officer Willie Hernandez in the first hour. His pulse did not spike. His hands did not rise. He turned his head slowly and looked at Hernandez with eyes that had seen the South China Sea at midnight, that had looked at the faces of men who were genuinely dangerous. And he said, in a voice that was quiet enough that it carried, "You need to look at my identification, officer. Before this goes any further, you need to look at what I am." Hernandez didn't look. He shoved. The doors opened. The Charleston night air hit Watts in the face. Behind him, through the closing glass, the chandelier kept shining, indifferent and brilliant, over the lobby of the Grand Marble Hotel. Watts stood on the sidewalk. He straightened his jacket. He touched the flag pin on his lapel to confirm it was still there. Then he reached into his inside pocket, pulled out his phone, and made the first of 3 calls. He wasn't locked out. They were locked in, with what they'd just done. And the clock had already started. 4 hours, $8.9 million. One man's silence as the sharpest weapon in the room. The town car pulled away from the curb without ceremony, the way good service always does. Present when needed, invisible when not. Robert Watts stood for a moment on the sidewalk outside the Grand Marble Hotel and let the Charleston evening settle around him. The salt air off the harbor carried the faint smell of tide and history, the particular perfume of a city that had been making and breaking fortunes since before the Republic existed. He had been to this city 4 times in his career, once for a Naval Readiness Summit, once for a burial at Sea Memorial at the Battery. He remembered both visits with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, complete, quiet, permanent. He was 55 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way that doesn't come from a gym but from decades of actual labor. Hauling lines, standing watch, carrying the physical and psychological weight of men under his command. His hair had gone fully silver in his late 40s, and he had stopped apologizing for it around the same time he stopped apologizing for anything else. And his face was the face of someone who had made hard decisions in difficult conditions and learned to live with the outcomes. Not hard in the sense of closed off, hard in the sense of settled, finished, the way good steel is finished. The suit was charcoal, freshly pressed, the collar of his white shirt open at the top. On his left lapel, a small American flag pin, enamel and gold, no larger than a thumbnail. He had worn it the morning he signed his retirement papers after 25 years of service. That he wore it tonight because this evening, in the Grand Marble's ballroom, 200 generals, undersecretaries, and defense contractors were gathering for a Department of Defense procurement conference that the hotel had secured for $50 million in contracted business. And Robert Watts, chief investigator for the Congressional Oversight Committee on Law Enforcement, 2 letters of commendation, former senior advisor to the Secretary of the Navy, was the keynote speaker. He picked up his garment bag, or crossed the sidewalk and walked through the front doors. The lobby received him the way expensive rooms receive everyone, with the same temperature, the same light, the same cultivated indifference. Marble underfoot, a chandelier overhead throwing crystal light in every direction, the faint sound of piano from somewhere deeper in the building. He crossed to the front desk and set his bag down with the care of a man who has learned not to be careless with things that matter. The clerk looked up. Her smile arrived on time, professional, practiced, and then, a fraction of a second, barely a movement at all, something shifted behind her eyes. A small recalibration, the kind Robert Watts had been reading on people's faces since he was 19 years old, walking into spaces that hadn't expected him. She kept the smile. She reached beneath the counter, and she picked up the phone. Craig Ashford took the call on the second ring. He was a man who prided himself on availability, on being the kind of general manager who kept his finger on the pulse of his property at all times. He was sitting behind his desk, reviewing the evening's seating arrangements for the DoD conference dinner, a glass of sparkling water sweating quietly on his leather blotter, when his front desk clerk's voice came through the line. Careful, measured, The particular tone his staff had learned to use when they wanted him to understand something without saying it directly. "There's a gentleman at the desk," she said. "He has a reservation, but—" She paused. "He doesn't quite seem like our usual guest." Ashford did not ask for a name. He did not ask to see the reservation number, the confirmation email, the credit card on file. He did not ask any of the questions that the job, that basic human decency, required him to ask. He looked through the interior window at the lobby and he saw a black man in a charcoal suit standing at his front desk, and he made a judgment in the time it takes to draw a breath, and that judgment cost him everything he had spent 20 years building. He picked up his second phone and dialed Willie Hernandez. Hernandez was the kind of cop that hotel managers in certain kinds of hotels kept on speed dial. A man who understood, without being told explicitly, what was being asked of him when he was called. He had been on the Charleston beat for 4 years. In that time, he had accumulated 9 complaints: excessive force, unlawful detention, conduct unbecoming, all of which had been administratively resolved, which is a phrase that means buried. He was thick through the neck and shoulders, his face carrying the permanent flush of a man whose blood pressure had been a problem since his 30s. But he had the eyes of someone who had never once walked into a room and felt unwelcome. The concept was genuinely foreign to him. He arrived in 4 minutes. He did not stop at the desk. He did not ask the clerk for context. He looked across the lobby, identified the man Ashford had described, and crossed the marble floor with the absolute confidence of someone who had already decided how this was going to go. Robert Watts heard the footsteps and turned. He had time to register the uniform. At the face, the set of the jaw. Time to begin a sentence to say, "Officer, I have a confirmed reservation if you'll just—" And then Hernandez's fist closed around the back of his jacket and the sentence ended. The screaming started immediately. Loud, formless, the words less important than the volume. "You need to leave. You don't belong here. Let's go. Now. Move." Each phrase shoved against the next like something desperate trying to fill all available space before reason could find room to breathe. The lobby froze. A woman near the elevator put her hand over her mouth. A man in a dinner jacket took a step backward. 3 phones rose into the air in the same moment, instinctive, simultaneous, screens tilting toward the 2 figures standing beneath the chandelier. The crystal kept throwing its light in every direction, indifferent and blazing. Over the marble floor, over the frozen faces, over the fist bunched in the jacket of a man who had not moved, had not raised his voice, had not lifted a single finger in response. The lobby was silent, except for Hernandez. And Hernandez did not stop. There is a discipline that the Navy teaches that has no official name in any training manual. It lives between the drills and the doctrine. I passed down through example rather than instruction, the ability to become still at the exact moment when everything around you is demanding that you move. Robert Watts had learned it at 19 on the deck of a destroyer in the North Atlantic, when a storm had come up fast and wrong, and the lieutenant beside him had panicked and Watts had not, and the difference between those 2 responses had mattered in ways that couldn't be measured after the fact. He had carried that stillness through 25 years. Through hostile briefing rooms and contested deployments and the particular violence of being a black man rising through institutions that had not been designed with his arrival in mind. He had needed it more times than he could count. He needed it now. He did not pull away from the grip. He did not raise his hands. He did not raise his voice. He turned his head with the slow, deliberate movement of someone who has all the time in the world, and looked at Willie Hernandez from a distance of approximately 8 inches and said, in a register that was almost quiet, "My name is Robert Watts. My confirmation number is GML4471 November. I am a registered guest of this hotel and the keynote speaker at the Department of Defense conference currently being hosted in your ballroom. I am asking you to release my jacket and allow me to proceed to the front desk." But Hernandez didn't hear it. Or he heard it the way certain men hear things they've already decided not to receive, as noise, as obstacle, as something to be pushed through rather than processed. His grip tightened, his volume increased. His free hand found Watts's shoulder, and the geometry of the moment shifted from confrontation to removal, Hernandez's body weight rotating, redirecting, steering the larger man toward the door with the practiced leverage of someone who had done this before and suffered no consequences for it. Watts let himself be moved, not from weakness, from the same calculation that had governed every decision in the lobby. The cold, clear understanding that the cameras were running, that the phones were up, that every second of stillness on his part was a second of exposure on Hernandez's. And that the most devastating thing he could do in this moment was absolutely nothing. The front doors opened. The Charleston night air arrived, and then the doors closed behind him, and the chandelier kept shining on the other side of the glass. And the lobby returned to its expensive silence, and Robert Watts stood on the sidewalk alone. He straightened his jacket. He touched the flag pin, both still there. Then he reached into his inside pocket, pulled out his phone, and scrolled to a name he had not needed to call in 14 months. His thumb hovered for one breath. Then he pressed it. The line connected on the first ring. Diane Okafor picked up on the first ring because Diane Okafor always picked up on the first ring. It was one of the things people said about her in the same breath as her record. 41 civil rights cases, 37 favorable verdicts, 4 settlements that had restructured entire municipal policies. She was 49 years old. At Georgetown Law, formerly senior litigation counsel for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, currently running her own practice out of a Washington office that was deliberately unimpressive from the outside and absolutely lethal from the inside. She had the particular quality of attention that made clients feel, from the first sentence, that their problem had just become someone else's emergency. Robert, she said. His name, nothing else. A prompt. He told her in 4 sentences: location, time, a nature of the incident, his status as keynote speaker for a federal conference currently in progress inside the building. There was a pause on the line that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. "Don't go back inside," she said. "Don't speak to management. Don't speak to Hernandez. I need you to send me every piece of documentation. Confirmation email, conference credentials, the works. I'll have a team in Charleston by midnight." She paused again. "Are you injured?" "My jacket," he said. "And my dignity. But I've had worse." She almost smiled. He could hear it. "I know you have," she said. "Sit tight. This is already a federal matter. You just don't know it yet." He ended the call and dialed the second number from memory. Senator James Caldwell, ranking member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, former Naval Advisory Board, a man who had sat across a table from Robert Watts in Bahrain in 2009 during a readiness review that had gone badly wrong. And who would not have navigated that situation without the counsel of the commander sitting beside him. Caldwell picked up before the second ring finished. "Robert. What's wrong?" Not a question. A man who understood that this particular person did not call without reason, Watts told him. Caldwell was quiet for 4 seconds. The kind of quiet that in a senator means something is being assembled rather than considered. Then, "I'm calling the secretary's office tonight." You have a federal conference in that building. This is a public accommodations violation under Title II and potentially a federal civil rights matter. Don't minimize it. Don't be gracious about it. Watts almost smiled at that last part. Caldwell knew him well enough to know the instinct. The third call was not a call. He opened his phone, went to his account, 2.1 million followers, accumulated over years of veteran advocacy and policy commentary, and posted a single image. And the lobby footage from the sharpest angle captured from his own phone in the seconds before the doors closed, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. The flag pin bright on his lapel. No caption, Nothing. Just the image. Time-stamped. Location tagged. Grand Marble Hotel, Charleston, South Carolina. He put the phone in his pocket and sat down on a bench across the street. 20 minutes later, he took it back out. The post had 400,000 views. He put it away again. And he looked at the hotel's lit facade across the cobblestones, the brass fittings gleaming, the doorman still at his post as though nothing had happened, as though the evening was proceeding exactly as designed. An hour after that, without touching the phone again, he knew the number had crossed 1 million. He could feel it the way you feel a tide change. Not dramatic, not loud, just an irreversible shift in the weight of things. Somewhere inside that building, Craig Ashford's phone was beginning to ring. And it was not going to stop. The ballroom was the finest room in the Grand Marble Hotel, and it knew it. 40-foot ceilings, walls paneled in pale gold, a second chandelier larger than the one in the lobby hanging above the round tables like a captive sun. 200 guests had been seated for 20 minutes. Generals with stars on their shoulders, undersecretaries in dark suits, and senior defense contractors who managed budgets larger than the GDP of small nations. The room had the particular energy of people who were accustomed to things beginning on time because they were the kind of people for whom the world generally arranged itself accordingly. The table settings were immaculate. The water glasses were full. The podium at the front of the room stood under a single warm spotlight, a small DOD seal affixed to its face, with a microphone waiting at exactly the right height for a man who was 6 feet tall. The keynote slot arrived at 7:30. The room settled. Conversations finished themselves and folded away. 200 sets of eyes moved to the podium. It was empty. The silence lasted 10 seconds before it began to acquire texture, the small sounds of people exchanging glances, a cleared throat, a chair leg shifting. And a conference aide materialized from the side entrance and crossed the room with the practiced invisibility of someone trying not to be noticed while moving very quickly. She disappeared through the service door. 45 seconds later, she was knocking on the door of Craig Ashford's office. Ashford was behind his desk, and he was not reviewing seating arrangements anymore. He had his personal phone in one hand and his work phone in the other, and his laptop open in front of him. And the number on the screen of his laptop had just crossed 1.2 million and was still climbing. The footage was everywhere. It had been picked up by 3 national outlets in the last 20 minutes. The comments were not the kind that required reading in full to understand their direction. His work phone had logged 11 missed calls in the past hour. His personal phone had logged 4, and including one from the corporate regional director, whose name in his contacts was followed by a small flag emoji that had seemed charming when he added it 3 years ago, and now seemed like a warning he hadn't known how to read. The aide told him about the podium. He nodded without looking up. He looked up when the DOD liaison knocked 30 seconds later. Her name was Colonel Patricia Vane, retired, and she administered federal hospitality contracts for the department across 14 states. She was a small woman with silver hair and the precise, unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades in rooms where imprecision had consequences. She closed the office door behind her. She looked at Ashford. She did not sit down. She asked him, quietly, where Robert Watts was. Ashford explained. He used words like misunderstanding and precautionary, and we're looking into it. And Colonel Vane listened to all of it without interrupting, her expression unchanged, and her laptop bag hanging from one shoulder. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she set her laptop bag on his desk, unzipped it, removed the laptop, and closed it without opening it. "This conference," she said, "is over." Ashford opened his mouth. "The $50 million contract this property holds with the Department of Defense," she continued, "will be under formal review as of tonight. You will receive written notification by 9 a.m. tomorrow. And I'd strongly recommend you have legal counsel by 8. She picked up her bag. She looked at him one more time with an expression that was not anger. Anger would have been easier. but something closer to the specific exhaustion of a person who has seen this particular kind of damage done before and had hoped, without much evidence, that it might someday stop. Then she walked out and left the door open behind her. In the ballroom, the podium was still empty. The spotlight was still on. 200 of the most powerful people in American defense sat in the finest room in the Grand Marble Hotel and waited for a man who was sitting on a bench across the street, watching the tide come in. The news vans arrived before the federal investigators, which was itself a kind of verdict. 3 satellite trucks from local affiliates, then a 4th from a national cable network. Then 2 more whose logos Ashford recognized from the television in his office, where he had spent the last hour watching his property become a story. They parked along the cobblestone street in a line that blocked the valet lane, their telescoping masts rising against the Charleston night sky like a second skyline. Camera operators set up on the sidewalk. Reporters touched their earpieces and straightened their jackets and turned to face the hotel's facade with the particular focus of people who understand that the building behind them is currently the most important building in the frame. Diane Okafor arrived at 8:47 in a black sedan that she stepped out of without hurrying. She was wearing a charcoal blazer and carrying a single leather folder, and she walked to the top of the hotel steps and turned to face the microphones with the composure of a woman who had been in front of cameras in harder circumstances than this and had never once said anything she did not mean to say. She opened the folder. She read the statement cleanly, without performance. The facts, the timeline, the legal framework, the nature of the complaint being filed. She named the hotel. She named Ashford. She named Hernandez. She answered 2 questions and declined the 3rd, and walked back to her sedan, and the cameras kept running after she was gone because the building was still there and the story was still moving. Willie Hernandez was still on shift when the call came from the precinct. He drove in with the unconcerned manner of a man who had been called in before and had always driven home afterward. His captain was behind his desk when Hernandez entered. I got a laptop open and turned to face the room. On the screen was the lobby footage. 12 seconds of it, the most watched 12 seconds on the internet at that particular moment. Hernandez watched himself. The fist in the jacket. The face. The screaming. The flag pin on the lapel of the man who had not moved. The captain said nothing for a long time. The footage looped. Hernandez watched it loop. Then the captain reached across the desk and closed the laptop and looked at him. "Turn in your badge," so he said. Tonight. The hearing room in the Dirksen Senate office building was the kind of room designed to make individuals feel the weight of institutional attention. High ceilings, long mahogany dais, the flags of the Republic standing at measured intervals behind the seated senators like a reminder of what was supposedly at stake in every proceeding held within these walls. Robert Watts sat at the witness table alone. No aide beside him, no prepared remarks on a teleprompter. Just the man and the microphone and the folder of documents he had organized himself in the same methodical way he had organized operational briefings for 2.5 decades. Chronologically, completely, without editorializing. He stated his name, he stated his service record, he stated his current federal position. And then he opened the folder and he recited the facts of the evening of October 14th, the way a navigator recites coordinates, with the understanding that precision is not coldness, that accuracy is its own form of testimony. Confirmation number GML4471 November. Check-in time, 6:51 p.m. Duration of lobby confrontation, approximately 4 minutes. Number of witnesses, at minimum 11. Number of recording devices, 3 personal phones confirmed, 1 hotel security camera. He named the clerk. He named Ashford. He named Hernandez. He gave badge numbers and timestamps, and the exact words he had spoken before the grip closed on his jacket. The room was completely silent in the way that large rooms are only silent when everyone in them has stopped pretending to do anything other than listen. He described what it was to be grabbed. Not the physics of it, the grip, the force, the direction, but what it cost, in the space between one breath and the next. To choose stillness over every instinct that 55 years of living in this country had trained into his body as survival. He did not perform this. He reported it, the way a good officer reports what he observed, and the absence of performance made it more devastating than grief would have been. A senator leaned toward her microphone. "Commander Watts," she said, her voice careful, "were you afraid?" He paused, not searching for the answer, already holding it, deciding whether to hand it over. "I was," he said. "I'm always afraid. I've just learned not to show it." The room stayed silent for a moment that lasted longer than moments usually do. Then the senator sat back and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be added. The number was $8.9 million, and it arrived not with drama, but with paperwork, the way most reckonings eventually do. Diane Okafor called it a resolution. The corporation's legal team called it a settlement reached in the interest of all parties. The press release used the phrase commitment to inclusive hospitality 3 times in 4 paragraphs, which was the kind of language that meant everything and nothing simultaneously and had been written by someone whose job was to ensure it meant as little as possible while sounding like it meant a great deal. None of it changed the number. $8.9 million to be distributed among a compensation fund for Robert Watts, a civil rights legal defense endowment, and a veterans advocacy initiative that Watts himself had specified as a condition of signing. The corporation had held out for 11 weeks. Then the DoD contract review concluded with a formal termination. Then the quarterly booking numbers came in showing a 34% decline in reservations across the brand's flagship properties. Then, 3 institutional clients announced they were moving their annual conferences to competitor hotels pending the outcome of the litigation. At that point, the holding out stopped, and the paperwork began. Hernandez had been terminated within 48 hours of the footage going national. The separate civil suit against him personally was proceeding on its own timeline, unhurried, thorough, with the particular patience of a legal process that already had 12 seconds of unambiguous video and 11 eyewitness statements and nowhere pressing to be. Ashford had submitted his resignation the morning after Colonel Vane walked out of his office, in a letter that cited personal reasons and a desire to pursue other opportunities, which was the professional equivalent of the lobby doors closing, a surface maintained over a reality that everyone understood. The corporation mandated new non-discrimination training across all 47 of its properties, effective immediately, be administered by an independent civil rights consultancy that Okafor had recommended and whose fees the corporation was also paying. Robert Watts watched the settlement announcement on the television in his Washington office. He watched it the way he watched most things, completely, quietly, without visible reaction. When it was over, he turned the screen off and picked up his phone and called Diane Okafor. She answered on the first ring. "What's next?" he said. She was already pulling up a file. When she had been expecting the question, she told him, and he listened, and then he picked up a pen. 6 months is not a long time in the life of a building. The marble does not change. The chandelier does not change. The gold columns catch the light in the same way they always have, indifferent to everything that has happened beneath them. And the lobby of the Grand Marble Hotel looked on the evening of April 9th, and almost exactly as it had looked on the evening of October 14th. The same temperature, the same cultivated quiet, the same sense of a room that had been designed to project permanence. Robert Watts stood on the sidewalk outside for a moment before going in. Not hesitating, just looking, the way you look at a place that has meant something, taking its measure before you step back into it. He was wearing the charcoal suit. The flag pin was on the left lapel. He pushed through the front doors and crossed the threshold, and the lobby received him. The new front desk manager, a tall woman named Clara, who had been brought in from the corporation's Atlanta property as part of the restructuring, looked up and said his name before he reached the counter. Not sir, not a generic greeting shaped into a question. His name. She produced the key card with both hands, the way you hand something to a person you are genuinely glad to receive. And she told him that the Foundation's event team had already arranged the ballroom and that his reserved table was front and center, and that if he needed anything at all this evening, the staff had been briefed and were available. She said all of this with the directness of someone who understood, without it needing to be articulated, the specific weight of this particular guest checking into this particular hotel on this particular night. He thanked her. He took the key card. He turned toward the ballroom and then stopped. He stood beneath the chandelier. The crystal threw its light in every direction, the same light it had always thrown over the same marble floor in the same grand room. He looked up at it for a moment, not long, just long enough. And then he looked straight ahead at the corridor that led to the ballroom where 200 people were gathering for the inaugural Civil Rights in Public Spaces Foundation Gala, funded in part by a settlement that a corporation had paid because it had underestimated catastrophically and completely the man it had thrown onto the pavement. He straightened his jacket. He touched the flag pin. Both still there, the way they had always been there, the way they would continue to be there regardless of who grabbed at him or what doors closed in his face or how many rooms decided before he entered them that he did not belong. Then he walked forward. But he had never needed to raise his voice. He had needed only to stand still long enough for the truth to accumulate its own momentum, to build its own weight, to arrive, as it always does, given enough time and enough refusal to disappear, with the force of something that was never going to be stopped, just delayed, just made to wait. And Robert Watts had learned over 55 years and 25 of them in service to a country still deciding what it believed about men like him, that patience applied with precision was not weakness. It was the most dangerous thing in any room. It was the thing that outlasted everything else. It was, in the end, the only weapon that always won. The ballroom doors opened ahead of him, and the light and the sound of gathered people spilled out into the corridor, and Robert Watts walked into the room.